The 20 men glanced at one another in puzzlement. At length Elric shrugged and led the party on, and soon the passage had widened out into a hall whose walls, roof, and floor were damp with sticky fluid, and whose air was hard to breathe. And now, somehow passing themselves through the walls of this hall, came the first of the defenders, ugly beasts who must be the servants of that mysterious brother and sister, Agak and Gagak. "Attack! Destroy this! Destroy it!" The beasts were of a primitive sort, mostly gaping mouth and slithering body, but there were many of them oozing towards the 20 men, who quickly formed themselves into the 4 fighting units and prepared to defend themselves. The creatures made a dreadful slushing sound as they approached, and the ridges of bone which served them as teeth clashed as they reared up to snap at Elric and his companions. Elric whirled his sword, and it met hardly any resistance as it sliced through several of the things at once. But now the air was thicker than ever, and a stench threatened to overwhelm them as fluid drenched the floor. "Move on through them," Elric instructed, "hacking a path as you go. Head for yonder opening." He pointed with his left hand. And so they advanced, cutting back hundreds of the primitive beasts, and thus decreasing the breathability of the air. "The creatures are not hard to fight," said Hound Serpent Tamer, "but each one we kill robs us a little of our own chances of life." Elric was aware of the irony. Cunningly planned by our enemies, no doubt. He coughed and slashed again at a dozen of the beasts slithering towards him. The things were fearless, but they were stupid too. They made no attempt at strategy. Finally, Elric reached the next passage where the air was slightly purer. He sucked gratefully at the sweeter atmosphere and waved his companions on. Sword arms rising and falling, they gradually retreated back into the passage, followed by only a few of the beasts. The creatures seemed reluctant to enter the passage, and Elric suspected that somewhere within must lie a danger which even they feared. There was nothing for it, however, but to press on, and he was only grateful that all 20 had survived this initial ordeal. Gasping, they rested for a moment, leaning against the trembling walls of the passage, listening to the tones of that distant voice, now muffled and indistinct. "I like not this castle at all," said Brute of Lashmere, inspecting a rent in his cloak where a creature had seized it. "High sorcery commands it." "It is only what we knew," Ashnar the Lynx reminded him, and Ashnar was plainly hard put to control his terror. The finger bones in his braids kept time with the trembling of the walls, and the huge barbarian looked almost pathetic as he steeled himself to go on. "They are cowards, these sorcerers," Otto Blenker said. "They do not show themselves." He raised his voice. "Is their aspect so loathsome they are afraid lest we look upon them?" It was a challenge not taken up. As they pushed on through the passages, there was no sign of either Agak or his sister, Gagak. It became gloomier and brighter in turns. Sometimes the passages narrowed so it was difficult to squeeze their bodies through. Sometimes they widened into what were almost halls. Most of the time they appeared to be climbing higher into the building. Elric tried to guess the nature of the building's inhabitants. There were no steps in the castle, no artifacts he could recognize. For no particular reason he developed an image of Agak and Gagak as reptilian in form, for reptiles would prefer gently rising passages to steps, and doubtless would have little need of conventional furniture. There again, it was possible that they could change their shape at will, assuming human form when it suited them. He was becoming impatient to face either one or both of the sorcerers. Ashnar the Lynx had other reasons, or so he said, for his own lack of patience. "They said there'd be treasure here. I thought to stake my life against a fair reward, but there's naught here of value." He put a horny hand against the damp material of the wall. "Not even stone or brick. What are these walls made of, Elric?" "That has puzzled me also, Ashnar." Then Elric saw large, fierce eyes peering out of the gloom ahead. He heard a rattling noise, a rushing noise, and the eyes grew larger and larger. He saw a red mouth, yellow fangs, orange fur. Then the growling sounded, and the beast sprang at him even as he raised Stormbringer to defend himself and shouted a warning to the others. The creature was a baboon, but huge, and there were at least a dozen others following the first. Elric drove his body forward behind his sword, taking the beast in its groin. Claws reached out and dug into his shoulder and waist. He groaned as he felt at least one set of claws draw blood. His arms were trapped, and he could not pull Stormbringer free. All he could do was twist the sword in the wound he'd already made. With all his might he turned the hilt. The great ape shouted, its bloodshot eyes blazing, and it bared its yellow fangs as its muzzle shot towards Elric's throat. The teeth closed on his neck, the stinking breath threatened to choke him. Again he twisted the blade. Again the beast yelled in pain. The fangs were pressing into the metal of Elric's gorget, the only thing saving him from immediate death. He struggled to free at least one arm, twisting the sword for the third time, then tugging it sideways to widen the wound in the groin. The growls and groans of the baboon grew more intense, and the teeth tightened their hold on his neck, but now, mingled with the noises of the ape, he began to hear a murmuring, and he felt Stormbringer pulse in his hand. He knew the sword was drawing power from the ape, even as the ape sought to destroy him. Some of that power began to flow into his body. Desperately, Elric put all of his remaining strength into dragging the sword across the ape's body, slitting its belly wide so that its blood and entrails spilled over him, and he was suddenly free and staggering backwards, wrenching the sword out in the same movement. The ape, too, was staggering back, staring down in stupefied awe at its own horrible wound before it fell to the floor of the passage. Elric turned, ready to give aid to his nearest comrade, and he was in time to see Elric of Melniboné die, kicking in the clutches of an even larger ape, his head bitten clean from his shoulders, his red blood gouting. Elric drove Stormbringer cleanly between the shoulders of Elric's slayer, taking the ape in the heart. Beast and human victim fell together. 2 others were dead, and several bore bad wounds, but the remaining warriors fought on, swords and armor smeared with crimson. The narrow passage stank of ape, of sweat and blood. Elric pressed into the fight, chopping at the skull of an ape which grappled with Hound's serpent tamer who had lost his sword. Hound darted a look of thanks at Elric as he bent to retrieve his blade, and together they set upon the largest of all the baboons. The creature stood much taller than Elric, and had Erikoze pressed against the wall, Erikoze's sword through its shoulder. From 2 sides, Hound and Elric stabbed, and the baboon snarled and screamed, turning to face the new attackers, Erikoze's blade quivering in its shoulder. It rushed upon them, and they stabbed again together, taking the monster in its heart and its lung, so that when it roared at them, blood vomited from its mouth. It fell to its knees, its eyes dimming, and then sank slowly down. And now there was silence in the passage, and death lay all about them. Elric of Melniboné was dead. 2 of Coram's party were also dead. All of Erikoze's surviving men bore major wounds. 1 of Hawkmoon's men was dead, but the remaining 3 were virtually unscathed. Brute of Lashmar's helm was dented, but he was otherwise unwounded, and Ashnar, the lynx, was disheveled, nothing more. Ashnar had taken 2 of the baboons during the fight, but now the barbarian's eyes rolled as he leaned, panting against the wall. "I begin to suspect this venture of being uneconomical," he said, with a half-grin. He rallied himself, stepping over a baboon's corpse to join Elric. "The less time we take over it, the better. What think you, Elric?" "I would agree." Elric returned his grin. "Come." And he led the way through the passage and into a chamber whose walls gave off a pinkish light. He had not walked far when he felt something catch at his ankle, and he stared down in horror to see a long, thin snake winding itself about his leg. It was too late to use his sword. Instead, he seized the reptile behind its head and dragged it partially free of his leg before hacking the head from the body. The others were now stomping and shouting warnings to each other. The snakes did not appear to be venomous, but there were thousands of them, appearing, it seemed, from out of the floor itself. They were flesh-colored and had no eyes, more closely resembling earthworms than ordinary reptiles, but they were strong enough. Hound Serpent Tamer sang a strange song now, with many liquid, hissing notes, and this seemed to have a calming effect upon the creatures. One by one at first, and then in increasing numbers, they dropped back to the floor, apparently sleeping. Hound grinned at his success. Elric said, "Now I understand how you came by your surname. I was not sure the song would work on these, but they're unlike any serpents I have ever seen in the seas of my own world." They waded on through mounds of sleeping serpents, noticing that the next passage rose sharply. At times they were forced to use their hands to steady themselves as they climbed the peculiar slippery material of the floor. It was much hotter in this passage, and they were all sweating, pausing several times to rest and mop their brows. The passage seemed to extend upwards forever, turning occasionally, but never leveling out for more than a few feet. At times it narrowed to little more than a tube through which they had to squirm on their stomachs, and at other times the roof disappeared into the gloom over their heads. Elric had long since given up trying to relate their position to what he'd seen of the castle from the outside. From time to time, small, shapeless creatures rushed towards them in shoals, apparently with the intention of attacking them, but these were rarely more than an irritation, and were soon all but ignored by the party as it continued its climb. For a while they had not heard the strange voice which had greeted them upon their entering, but now it began to whisper again, its tones more urgent than before. Where? Oh, the pain. They paused, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Grim-faced they continued, plagued by thousands of little creatures which bit at their exposed flesh like so many gnats, yet the creatures were not insects. Elric had seen nothing like them before. They were shapeless, primitive, and all but colorless. They battered at his face as he moved. They were like a wind. Half-blinded, choked, sweating, he felt his strength leaving him. The air was so thick now, so hot, so salty, it was as if he moved through liquid. The others were as badly affected as was he. Some were staggering, and 2 men fell, had to be helped up again by comrades almost as exhausted. Elric was tempted to strip off his armor, but he knew this would leave more of his flesh to the mercy of the little flying creatures. Still they climbed, and now more of the serpentine things they had seen earlier began to writhe around their feet, hampering them further, for all that Hound sang his sleeping song until he was hoarse. "We can survive this only a little longer," said Ashnar the lynx, moving close to Elric. "We shall be in no condition to meet the sorcerer if we ever find him or his sister." Elric nodded a gloomy head. "My thoughts too. Yet what else may we do, Ashnar?" "Nothing," said Ashnar. "Nothing." Where? The word rustled all about them. Many of the party were becoming openly nervous. Chapter 5. The Meaning of Shadows. They had reached the top of the passage. The querulous voice was much louder now, but it quavered more. They saw an archway, and beyond the archway, a lighted chamber. "Agak's room, without doubt," said Ashnar, taking a better grip on his sword. "Possibly," said Elric. He felt detached from his body. Perhaps it was the heat and the exhaustion or his growing sense of disquiet, but something made him withdraw into himself and hesitate before entering the chamber. The place was octagonal, and each of its 8 sloping sides was of a different color, and each color changed constantly. Occasionally the walls became semi-transparent, revealing a complete view of the ruined city, or collection of cities, far below, and also a view of the twin castle to this one, still connected by tubes and wires. It was the large pool in the center of the chamber which attracted most of their attention. It seemed deep, and was full of evil-smelling, viscous stuff. It bubbled. Shapes formed in it, grotesque and strange, beautiful and familiar. The shape seemed always on the brink of taking permanent form before falling back into the stuff of the pool. And the voice was still louder, and there was no question now that it came from the pool. What? Who invades?" Elric forced himself closer to the pool and for a moment saw his own face staring out at him before it melted. "Who invades? I am too weak." Elric spoke to the pool. "We are of those you would destroy. We are those on whom you would feed." Agak, I'm sick. Where are you?" Ashnar and Brute joined Elric. The faces of the warriors were filled with disgust. "Agak," growled Ashnar the lynx, his eyes narrowing. "At last, some sign that the sorcerer is here." The others had all crowded in to stand as far away from the pool as possible, but all stared, fascinated by the variety of shapes forming and disintegrating in the viscous liquid. "I'm weakening. My energy needs to be replenished. We must begin now. Agak. It took us so long to reach this place. I thought I could rest, but there is disease here. It fills my body. Agak, awaken. Agak, awaken." "Some servant of Agak's charged with the defense of the chamber?" suggested Helm, the serpent tamer. But Elric continued to stare into the pool. As he began, he thought, to realize the truth. "Will Agak awake?" Brute said. "Will he come?" He glanced nervously around him. "Agak!" called Ashnar the Lynx. "Coward!" "Agak!" cried many of the other warriors, brandishing their swords. But Elric said nothing, and he noted too that Hawkmoon and Corum and Ericose all remained silent. He guessed that they must be filled with the same dawning understanding. He looked at them. In Ericose's eyes he saw an agony, a pity both for himself and his comrades. "We are the four who are one," said Ericose, his voice shaking. Elric was seized by an alien impulse, an impulse which disgusted and terrified him. "No!" He attempted to sheathe Stormbringer, but the sword refused to enter its scabbard. "Agak, quickly!" said the voice from the pool. "If we do not do this thing," said Ericose, "they will eat all our worlds. Nothing will remain." Elric put his free hand to his head. He swayed on the edge of that frightful pool. He moaned. "We must do it, then." Corum's voice was an echo. "I will not," said Elric. "I am myself." "And I," said Hawkmoon. But Corum said, "It is the only way for us, for the single thing that we are. Do you not see that? We are the only creatures of our worlds who possess the means of slaying the sorcerers, in the only manner in which they can be slain." Elric looked at Corum, at Hawkmoon, at Ericose, and again he saw something of himself in all of them. "We are the four who are one," said Ericose. "Our united strength is greater than the sum. We must come together, brothers. We must conquer here before we can hope to conquer Agak." "No." Elric moved away, but somehow he found himself standing at a corner of the bubbling, noxious pool from which the voice still murmured and complained, in which shapes still formed, reformed, and faded, and at each of the other three corners stood one of his companions. All had a set, fatalistic look to them. The warriors who had accompanied the four drew back to the walls. Otto Blenker and Brute of Lashmar stood near the doorway, listening for anything which might come up the passage to the chamber. Ashnar the Lynx fingered the brand at his belt, a look of pure horror on his rugged features. Elric felt his arm begin to rise, drawn upward by his sword, and he saw that each of his three companions were also lifting their swords. The swords reached out across the pool, and their tips met above the exact center. Elric yelled as something entered his being. Again he tried to break free, but the power was too strong. Other voices spoke in his head. "I understand." This was Corum's distant murmur. "It is the only way." "Oh, no, no!" And this was Hawkmoon, but the words came from Elric's lips. "Agak!" cried the pool. The stuff became more agitated, more alarmed. "Agak! Quickly! Wake!" Elric's body began to shake, but his hand kept a firm hold upon the sword. The atoms of his body flew apart, and then united again into a single flowing entity which traveled up the blade of the sword towards the apex. And Elric was still Elric, shouting with the terror of it, sighing with the ecstasy of it. Elric was still Elric when he drew away from the pool and looked upon himself for a single moment, seeing himself wholly joined with his three other selves. A being hovered over the pool. On each side of its head was a face, and each face belonged to one of the companions. Serene and terrible, the eyes did not blink. It had 8 arms, and the arms were still. It squatted over the pool on 8 legs, and its armor and accoutrement were of all the colors blending, and at the same time separate. The being clutched a single great sword in all 8 hands, and both he and the sword glowed with a ghastly golden light. Then Elric had rejoined this body and had become a different thing, himself and 3 others, and something else which was the sum of that union. The 4 who were one reversed its monstrous sword so the point was directed downward at the frenetically boiling stuff in the pool below. The stuff feared the sword. It mewled, "Agag! Agag!" The being of whom Elric was a part gathered its great strength and began to plunge the sword down. Shapeless waves appeared on the surface of the pool. Its whole color changed from sickly yellow to an unhealthy green. "Agag! I die!" Inexorably the sword moved down. It touched the surface. The pool swept back and forth. It tried to ooze over the sides and onto the floor. The sword bit deeper, and the 4 who were one felt new strength flow up the blade. Then came a moan. Slowly the pool quieted. It became silent. It became still. It became gray. Then the 4 who were one descended into the pool to be absorbed. It could see clearly now. It tested its body. It controlled every limb, every function. It had triumphed. It had revitalized the pool. Through its single octagonal eye, it looked in all directions at the same time over the wide ruins of the city. Then it focused all its attention upon its twin. Agag had awakened too late, but he was awakening at last, roused by the dying cries of his sister Gagak, whose body the mortals had first invaded, and whose intelligence they had overwhelmed, whose eye they now used, and whose powers they would soon attempt to utilize. Agag did not need to turn his head to look upon the being he still saw as his sister. Like hers, his intelligence was contained within the huge 8-sided eye. "Did you call me, sister?" "I spoke your name. That is all, brother." There were enough vestiges of Gagak's life force in the 4 who were one for it to imitate her manner of speaking. "You cried out?" "A dream." The 4 paused, and then it spoke again. "A disease. I dreamed that there was something upon this island which made me unwell." "Is that possible? We do not know sufficient about these dimensions or the creatures inhabiting them, yet none is as powerful as Agag. And Gagak, fear not, sister. We must begin our work soon." "It is nothing. Now I am awake." Agag was puzzled. "You speak oddly." "The dream," answered the creature which had entered Gagak's body and destroyed her. "We must begin," said Agag. "The dimensions turn, the time has come. Ah, feel it. It waits for us to take it so much rich energy. How we shall conquer when we go home." "I feel it," replied the 4, and it did. It felt its whole universe, dimension upon dimension, swirling about it, stars and planets and moons through plane upon plane, all full of the energy upon which Agag and Gagak had desired to feed. And there was enough of Gagak still within the 4 to make the 4 experience a deep, anticipatory hunger which, now that the dimensions attained the right conjunction, would soon be satisfied. The 4 was tempted to join with Agag and feast, although it knew if it did so, it would rob its own universe of every shred of energy. Stars would fade, worlds would die. Even the Lords of Law and Chaos would perish, for they were part of the same universe. Yet, to possess such power, it might be worth committing such a tremendous crime. It controlled this desire, and gathered itself for its attack before Agag became too wary. "Shall we feast, sister?" The four realized that the ship had brought it to the island at exactly the proper moment. Indeed, they had almost come too late. "Sister?" Agag was again puzzled. "What?" The four knew it must disconnect from Agag. The tubes and wires fell away from his body and were withdrawn into Agag's. "What's this?" Agag's strange body trembled for a moment. "Sister?" The four prepared itself. For all that it had absorbed Agag's memories and instincts, it was still not sufficient that it would be able to attack Agag in her chosen form. And since the sorceress had possessed the power to change her form, the four began to change, groaning greatly, experiencing dreadful pain, drawing all the materials of its stolen being together, so that what had appeared to be a building now became a pulpy, unformed flesh. And Agag, stunned, looked on. "Sister, your sanity!" The building, the creature that was Agag, threshed, melted, and erupted. It screamed in agony. It attained its form. It laughed. 4 faces laughed upon a gigantic head. 8 arms waved in triumph. 8 legs began to move. And over that head it waved a single, massive sword, and it was running. It ran upon Agag while the alien sorcerer was still in his static form. Its sword was whirling, and shards of ghastly golden light fell away from it as it moved, lashing the shadowed landscape. The 4 was as large as Agag, and at this moment it was as strong. But Agag, realizing his danger, began to suck. No longer would this be a pleasurable ritual shared with his sister. He must suck at the energy of this universe if he were to find the strength to defend himself, to gain what he needed to destroy his attacker, the slayer of his sister. Worlds died as Agag sucked. But not enough. Agag tried cunning. "This is the center of your universe. All its dimensions intersect here. Come, you can share the power. My sister is dead. I accept her death. You shall be my partner now. With this power, we shall conquer a universe far richer than this." "No," said the 4, still advancing. "Very well, but be assured of your defeat." The 4 swung its sword. The sword fell upon the faceted eye within which Agag's intelligence pool bubbled, just as his sister's had once bubbled, but Agag was stronger already and healed himself at once. Agag's tendrils emerged and lashed at the 4, and the 4 cut at the tendrils as it sought his body, and Agag sucked more energy to himself. His body, which the mortals had mistaken for a building, began to glow burning scarlet and to radiate an impossible heat. The sword roared and flared so that black light mingled with the gold and flowed against the scarlet, and all the while the 4 could sense its own universe shrinking and dying. "Give back, Agag, what you have stolen," said the 4. Planes and angles and curves, wires and tubes flickered with deep red heat, and Agag sighed. The universe whimpered. "I am stronger than you. Now." And Agag sucked again. The 4 knew that Agag's attention was diverted for just that short while as he fed, and the 4 knew that it too must draw energy from its own universe if Agag were to be defeated, so the sword was raised. The sword was flung back, its blade slicing through tens of thousands of dimensions and drawing their power to it. Then it began to swing back. It swung and black light bellowed from its blade. It swung, and Agag became aware of it. His body began to alter down toward the sorcerer's great eye. Down towards Agag's intelligence pool swept the black blade. Agag's many tendrils rose to defend the sorcerer against the sword, but the sword cut through them as if they were not there, and it struck the 8-sided chamber which was Agag's eyes, and it plunged on down into Agag's intelligence pool, deep into the stuff of the sorcerer's sensibility, drawing up Agag's energy into itself, and thence into its master, the 4 who were one. And something screamed through the universe, and something sent a tremor through the universe, and the universe was dead, even as Agag began to die. The 4 did not dare wait to see if Agag were completely vanquished. It swept the sword out, back through the dimensions, and everywhere the blade touched, the energy was restored. The sword rang round and round, dispersing the energy, and the sword sang its triumph and its glee. And little shreds of black and golden light whispered away and were reabsorbed. For a moment, the universe had been dead. Now it lived, and Agag's energy had been added to it. Agag lived too, but he was frozen. He had attempted to change his shape. Now he still half resembled the building Elric had seen when he first came to the island, but part of him resembled the four who were one. Here was a part of Coram's face, here a leg, there a fragment of sword blade, as if Agag had believed, at the end, that the four could only be defeated if its own form were assumed, just as the four had assumed Gagag's form. We had waited so long, Agag sighed, and then he was dead. And the four sheathed its sword. Then there came a howling through the ruins of the many cities, and a strong wind blustered against the body of the four, so it was forced to kneel on its 8 legs and bow its 4-faced head before the gale. Then, gradually, it reassumed the shape of Gagag the sorceress, and then it lay within Gagag's stagnating intelligence pool, and then it rose over it, hovered for a moment, withdrew its sword from the pool. The 4 beings fled apart, and Elric and Hawkmoon and Ericose and Coram stood with sword blades touching over the center of the dead brain. The 4 men sheathed their swords. They stared for a second into each other's eyes, and all saw terror and awe there. Elric turned away. He could find neither thoughts nor emotions in him which would relate to what had happened. There were no words he could use. He stood looking dumbly at Ashnar the Lynx, and he wondered why Ashnar giggled and chewed at his beard and scraped at the flesh of his own face with his fingernails, his sword forgotten upon the floor of the grey chamber. "Now I have flesh again! Now I have flesh!" Ashnar kept saying. Elric wondered why Hound Serpent Tamer lay curled in a ball at Ashnar's feet, and why when Brute of Lashmar emerged from the passage he fell down and lay stretched upon the floor, stirring a little and moaning, as if in a disturbed slumber. Otto Blenker came into the chamber. His sword was in its scabbard. His eyes were shut tight, and he hugged himself, shivering. Elric thought to himself, "I must forget all this, or sanity will disappear forever." He went to Brute and helped the blond warrior to his feet. "What did you see?" "More than I deserve for all my sins. We were trapped in that skull." And then Brute began to weep as a small child might weep, and Elric took the tall warrior in his own arms and stroked his head, and could not find words or sounds with which to comfort him. "We must go," said Ericose. His eyes were glazed. He staggered as he walked. Thus, dragging those who had fainted, leading those who had gone mad, leaving those who had died behind, they fled through the dead passages of Gagag's body, no longer plagued by the things she had created in her attempt to rid that body of those she had experienced as an invading disease. The passages and chambers were cold and brittle, and the men were glad when they stood outside and saw the ruins, the sourceless shadows, the red static sun. Otto Blenker was the only one of the warriors who seemed to retain his sanity through the ordeal, when they'd been absorbed unknowingly into the body of the 4 who were one. He dragged his brand from his belt, took out his tinder and ignited it. Soon the brand was flaming, and the others lighted theirs from his. Elric trudged to where Agag's remains still lay, and shuddered as he recognized in a monstrous stone face part of his own features. He felt that the stuff could not possibly burn, but it did. Behind him Gagag's body blazed too. They were swiftly consumed, and pillars of growling fire jutted up into the sky, sending up a smoke of white and crimson, which for a little while obscured the red disk of the sun. The men watched the corpses burn. "I wonder," said Coram, "if the captain knew why he sent us here. Or if he suspected what would happen," said Hawkmoon. Hawkmoon's tone was near to resentful. Only that being could battle Agak and Gagak in anything resembling their own terms," said Ericose. "Other means would not have been successful. No other creature could have had the particular qualities, the enormous power needed to slay such strange sorcerers." "So it seems," said Elric, and he would talk no more of it. "Hopefully," said Coram, "you will forget this experience as you forgot, or will forget, the other." Elric offered him a hard stare. "Hopefully, brother," he said. Ericose's chuckle was ironic. "Who could recall that?" And he, too, said no more. Ashnar the lynx, who had ceased his gigglings as he watched the fire, shrieked suddenly and broke away from the main party. He ran towards the flickering column and then veered away, disappearing among the ruins in the shadows. Otto Blenker gave Elric a questioning stare, but Elric shook his head. "Why follow? What can we do for it?" He looked down at Hound Serpent Tamer. He had particularly liked the man in the sea-green armor. He shrugged. When they moved on, they left the curled body of Hound Serpent Tamer where it lay, helping only Brute of Lashmar across the rubble and down to the shore. Soon they saw the white mist ahead and knew they neared the sea, though the ship was not in sight. At the edge of the mist, both Hawkmoon and Ericose paused. "I will not rejoin the ship," said Hawkmoon. "I feel I've served my passage now. If I can find Tanalorn, this, I suspect, is where I must look." "My own feelings," Ericose nodded his head. Elric looked at Coram. Coram smiled. "I have already found Tanalorn. I go back to the ship in the hope that soon it will deposit me on a more familiar shore." "That is my hope," said Elric. His arm still supported Brute of Lashmar. Brute whispered, "What was it? What happened to us?" Elric increased his grip upon the warrior's shoulder. "Nothing," he said. Then, as Elric tried to lead Brute back into the mist, the blond warrior stepped back, breaking free. I will stay," he said. He moved away from Elric. "I'm sorry." Elric was puzzled. "Brute?" "I am sorry. I fear you. I fear that ship." Elric made to follow the warrior, but Coram put a hard silver hand upon his shoulder. "Comrade, let us be gone from this place." His smile was bleak. "It is what is back there I fear more than the ship." They stared over the ruins. In the distance they could see the remains of the fire, and there were two shadows there now, the shadows of Gagak and Agak, as they had first appeared to them. Elric drew a cold breath of air. "With that, I agree," he told Coram. Otto Blenker was the only warrior who chose to return to the ship with them. "If that is Tanalorn, it is not, after all, the place I sought," he said. Soon they were waist-deep in the water. They saw again the outlines of the dark ship. They saw the captain leaning on the rail, his arm raised as if in salute to someone or something upon the island. "Captain," called Cole, "we come aboard." "You are welcome," said the captain. "Yes, you are welcome." The blind face turned towards them as Elric reached out for the rope ladder. "Would you care to sail for a while into the silent places, the restful places?" "I think so," said Elric. He paused halfway up the ladder and touched his head. "I have many wounds." He reached the rail, and with his own cool hands the captain helped him over. "They will heal, Elric." Elric moved closer to the mast. He leaned against it and watched the silent crew as they unfurled the sail. Coram and Otto Blenker came aboard. Elric listened to the sharp sound of the anchor as it was drawn up. The ship swayed a little. Otto Blenker looked at Elric, then at the captain, and then he turned and went into his cabin, saying nothing at all as he closed the door. The sail filled, the ship began to move. The captain reached out and found Elric's arm. He took Coram's arm, too, and led them towards his cabin. The wine, it will heal all the wounds. At the door of the captain's cabin, Elric paused. And does the wine have other properties? Does it cloud a man's reason? Was it that which made me accept your commission, Captain? The captain shrugged. What is reason? The ship was gathering speed. The white mist was thicker and a cold wind blew at the rags of cloth and metal Elric wore. He sniffed, thinking for a moment that he smelled smoke upon that wind. He put his 2 hands to his face and touched his flesh. His face was cold. He let his hands fall to his sides, and he followed the captain into the warmth of the cabin. The captain poured wine into silver cups from his silver jug. He stretched out a hand to offer a cup to Elric and to Coram. They drank. A little later, the captain said, How do you feel? Elric said, I feel nothing. And that night, he dreamed only of shadows, and in the morning, he could not understand his dream at all.